So Tom, you've been studying business, writing about management for these many years. What is your current area of excitement?
So obviously the middle market is my day job and my obsession, but what's keeping me up at night is some thinking about an emerging topic that's called service design. Service design is sort of the most important management discipline you've never heard of. And its fundamental concept is that services can and should be designed just as carefully as products are. And so service design is sort of looking at how you craft every element of your interaction with customers so that you create the value proposition that you want. One of the big differences between manufacturing and services is in manufacturing, the customer's outside the factory gate. In services, whether it's a little bit more off the top,
they're right on you.
Or in the hospital or wherever, right?
Yeah.
They're in there messing things up.
Yeah.
So how do you actually think about what you can do to design this experience so you are feeding people, you know, in the directions that you want to feed them? How can you do this so that it's predictable? So service design should not require heroic efforts on your part, and nor should it require heroic efforts on your customer's part. I mean, it shouldn't, you know, I shouldn't have to try 15 things in order to get to a live person on the telephone.
You're designing the simplest path to delight, basically.
And there's an elegance question. Just as in design, nothing's left out, nothing's extra. How do you actually think about that in this complicated thing where the customer's mucking things up? So I think it's an emerging field. They're starting to see a few conferences about it, a little bit of academic research on it, and as I said, I'm working on a project about this that I hope that, you know, ink readers or some other readers will be seeing more about before
Could
too
be
long.
interesting. In some of your center's most recent reports, I think you were talking about how manufacturing and healthcare sectors in particular were big drivers of growth for middle market companies.
They have been in the last quarter or so. A number of things. First of all, I think the macro trend that we are seeing with onshoring, with business coming back, reflects the changing competitive advantage of manufacturing in the United States versus manufacturing in China or other low-cost environments. You know, I mean, they have learned to cope just as Japanese manufacturers learned to cope with the revaluation of the yen. You know, U.S. manufacturers have learned to cope with the tougher competitive environment. So I think they're benefiting from the general rising tide of U.S. manufacturing. And they're
interesting. This is kind of the clearest articulation I've heard of, you know, the argument for a resurgence in manufacturing in America.
The other thing is they're here. Right? So let's imagine I'm, you know, XYZ big company, and I have offshored some manufacturing stuff to Mexico or offshored it to China or something like this, and I now want to bring it back. That is a big strategic decision. These guys, and it's one of their weaknesses, the middle market guys, tend to be domestic players. 2 out of 3 of them are not participating in international markets as buyers or sellers, let alone as outsourcers. So if the competitive advantage domestically in manufacturing has returned, they should be responding to it quicker because they've already got the plant there. It's not a matter of moving stuff from Mexico back or from China back. It's just a matter of doing more of what they're already doing.
So what about healthcare?
I think 2 things. First of all, the number you're citing is in the second quarter of this year.
Right.
First quarter of this year, healthcare was a sort of a wonky number, right? What we saw is that with the advent of the Affordable Care Act, a whole lot of stuff was like, what are we doing? We're a little on hold. How are we thinking about this, that, and the other? And now people have figured out more or less how to handle the Affordable Care Act. I don't think there are a lot of middle market pharma companies. I think most of the pharmaceutical companies are big guys, right? But I think that almost all hospitals fall into our category between $10 million and $1 billion. And so I suspect that growth we're seeing is in hospital utilization. They are doing the most interesting research and applied research in operations of any place. I mean, most of what we know about how to run a company from an operations point of view, we learned from the automobile industry in the 20th century, from Toyota and from Drucker and Deming and all of this stuff. The stuff that's going on in hospitals now, these are the Toyotas and the General Motors and the Fords of the 21st century. And we are learning stuff in management, in healthcare, in hospitals, that is going to change the way every company in the world is run. If you want to think about the most complicated, the most complex working environment of the 21st century, it's the big city tertiary care hospital, where everything from neurosurgery to laundry is done in the same building, and where you have a fraternity or a guild or a privileged class.
We're almost talking about like an enclosed company town, like as we saw in
well, except it's wilder. It's wilder, right?
Exactly.
I'm the surgeon, and I can tell anybody what to do, including the hospital administrator, right? I mean, the complexity of what goes on in hospitals is infinitely larger than what goes on in an automobile assembly plant because every patient is different, and it hasn't been solved yet.
Let's talk about it in terms of management challenges. I think there's probably some excellent examples of hospitals that have really stepped up to this.
Well, actually, one of them is a group of hospitals in Wisconsin called Theta Care. They got extraordinarily interested in what you could learn from the Toyota production system. One of the facts is that the third largest cause of death is medical error. So if you think about these issues, you have all kinds of examples of, is best practice consistently applied? If you show up at a hospital with symptoms of a heart attack and show up in the ER, are you given aspirin within 10 minutes? Right? Theta Care started applying this question, and they found a bell curve. Right? Here's the hospital where it happens 100% of the time, here's the hospital where it happens 20% of the time, and here's the ones in the middle. You can move that bell curve, and you can do extraordinary stuff. Basically by finding out what best practices were, applying them, and by the way, then telling those arrogant surgeons, no, you have to do this, right? This is the way it's done, and enforcing some process consistency.
I know the concept of service design is very important to you, and I believe that hospitals are kind of, a crucible of that innovation. Can you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Simple example. What's the one thing that you know is a constant? You know that your lunch, that if you're in room 1257, your lunch is going to come at 11:42. And the other thing you know is that at the same time that your lunch comes, the nurse will come to change your sheets, and the doctor will come to check your blood pressure. Now, why is that? How can you design things so that the patient experience is better in that simple way? Those are simple things to say, but it actually turns out to be very hard to do with all these guilds, all this complexity, and the fact that you're different from me, so the guy in one room is different from the guy in the next room, even if they're in the same ward.
In your view, what are the advantages that the middle market companies have over smaller companies?
Well, first of all, those advantages that inure to small companies largely inure to middle market companies as well. And it can give them an advantage over small companies. It used to be that the five of us around the table could solve this whole business, and we could, but now I suddenly need to bring in some people who have some expertise, and maybe they start getting turf wars, but they, so you have some problems that can come, but you can also get some professionalization of management that really can drive you to that next level of growth. So that's, I think, an important advantage. And they have some of the advantages of brand recognition. So they get, in some cases, they can get the best of both worlds.